The original idea of this meeting was to really examine the current state of play with the Lords Resitance Army, looking at the past 3 or 4 months in terms of the evolution of the organization, to ask the question, what are its prospects? Is what we've seen in these 3 months the last kicks of a dying horse, or are we seeing a regrouping and a splintering and yet worse to come? And in the last few weeks, I'm sure you've all heard about the resupply of the Lords Resitance Army and the continuing attacks by its adherents.
So why Juba in 2006? The explanation is the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. Juba now had self-government. They now were governing a large part of their own issues, and it was felt in Juba that having the LRA still in the country was a huge security risk, and that led to President Salva Kiir prevailing upon President Museveni in Uganda to allow his government to mediate. But in fact, it wasn't President Salva Kiir's idea. This is an old idea that even John Garang had nurtured and had been discussing, that there should be a settlement like that had a settlement with Khartoum. Uganda should have a settlement with the LRA so that there would be a comprehensive and neat tying up of this insurgency, which was costing Southern Sudan quite a lot and risking a lot of issues to do with the CPA. So that's why I would say that President Museveni agreed to that process and sent his delegation. The approach to the negotiations took the government of Uganda by surprise, I think. I think the mediator and his team decided that as far as possible, they should go for a complete and comprehensive agreement. Therefore, on the agenda, it wasn't just the question of a ceasefire and disarmament, but it started by looking, after the cessation of hostilities, by looking at what was called comprehensive solutions.
Do you think there was a fundamental flaw with the process? I mean, was it the personalities? Was it the process? Was it...
I think from our perspective, so Human Rights Watch, who followed this process also very closely, obviously from a justice perspective, there were a number of key issues, and I won't go through all of those at the moment, but one was that throughout the entire peace process, of course, the LRA continued to commit abuses. Now, the LRA had moved into northern Congo, to Garamba National Park, one of the national parks in northern Congo, in late 2005. And I think one thing that Barney forgot to mention, which I think also pushed them actually towards peace talks, was a failed military operation by the United Nations so just a few months after the LRA had moved into Congo. One of the first ever covert United Nations operations. You know, it's rare that we have covert UN operations. This was one of them. Attempted to get at the camps that the LRA was seeking to establish. Guatemalan peacekeepers, a number of them were killed, at least 8 of them were killed in this ambush. And I think the international community lost its appetite to deal with the LRA in Congo. But throughout the time that the LRA were in peace talks, abuses continued. Now, not necessarily in Congo, though some were in Congo, but actually they went on consistent raids into southern Sudan and into the Central African Republic in order to abduct people to bring back to their base in Congo. And very little was said about that during the peace talks. And initially, when the information came out about the abuses being committed in Central African Republic, it was very uncomfortable for some of the international community members who were supporting the peace talks, and there was an attempt to repress those reports with the fear of upsetting the peace process. So I think that's just one other thing to keep in mind. And lastly, I would say there's now indications, easy to say with hindsight, of course, but that actually during those 2 years when talks were going back and forth, that members of the LRA were continuing to stockpile goods, to stockpile food and other kinds of supplies, indicating they may never have been very serious about the peace talks to begin with.
LRA insisted on being tried in Uganda. Kony himself has repeatedly said he's convinced that if he ever goes back to Uganda or turns himself over to Ugandan authorities, he'll be hanged. Well, certainly that won't happen at the ICC. They don't execute people there. So his chances are better of survival, if that's his issue, are better with the ICC. Secondly, or thirdly, the issue of addressing the root causes of the war have never been addressed, and they still haven't been addressed. And I think the chances of that happening, you know, are slim. So all the main issues that revolved around the peace talks were never really going to be resolved.
Joseph, what, in your view, led to the failure of these talks? Or what?
My view is that the entire process was fundamentally flawed.
Yeah.
And actually the point that we're actually saying that we shouldn't, that perhaps they shouldn't have been focusing on is exactly what they should have been focusing on. There is no way in which we could go ahead and forge some kind of peace agreement in Congo between two powerful military forces without addressing the root causes. The victims of LRA, are ordinary Ugandans. The victims of Museveni and his army are ordinary Ugandans. Now, if the international community is interested in Uganda, we need a comprehensive political approach inside Uganda. And I'm actually quite shocked that the Congolese president, the Sudanese president, I'm not really surprised about the US, you know, under Bush, that they could have, at the time when there was a semblance of peace over a two-year period when these guys were talking in Juba, instead of actually them putting pressure on Museveni, putting pressure on Kony, dealing and engaging with Ugandan civil society and Ugandan political organizations, including ourselves, to try and look at the root causes and make sure that they carry this as a tiny little bit, regardless of what Kony and Museveni have done. And for heaven's sake, the vast majority of Ugandans probably really don't care very much about Kony and Museveni, if you want to present it that way. But by and large, whether we like it or not, they're there, they're Ugandans, both of them are armed. Museveni has attempted to fight these guys for the last 20 years and failed. And there is evidence in Uganda that while Museveni is doing that, he himself was committing massive atrocities. So it's an interesting point which has just been made by Bernie, that 2 weeks to the failure of the signing of the agreement, there was an operation. So quite clearly it meant that Museveni himself was preparing for war. So Museveni was preparing for war, and Kony naturally was preparing for war. And I'm saying this against the background of being one of those few people who were fundamentally frustrated, Patrick. I don't know whether we discussed this with you before. I happen to have been one of those people who were mandated by my party over a 3-year period, up to about 4 or 5 years ago, attempting to persuade the international community that it is actually possible to talk peace in Uganda. And I know some serious Western diplomats telling me in my face that, Joseph, you're being crazy. You can't talk to these guys. But I think we proved them wrong, that we brought these guys to a round table. But of course, they can come back and tell me that why wasn't it resolved? But because it was not resolved, that is why, one of the reasons why I'm here. We are here. But I think it is still possible for us to deal with the conflicts in northern Uganda. But I think the conflicts in northern Uganda will have to take a comprehensive look at the situation in Uganda and a comprehensive look in the situation in the region.